In the cold winter of 1878, a weary traveling merchant named Jacob Hensworth rode into the isolated community of Cedar Valley, Utah. On his shoulder swung a worn leather satchel, nothing unusual at first glance until you realized what it carried. Inside was not merchandise nor trinkets to barter, but something infinitely heavier, a record of secrets. That satchel contained genealogical papers, birth certificates, letters, and a truth so sinister it threatened to tear apart the very image of Cedar Valley's most respected family, the Fairmonts. And here's something I'd like to ask you as you settle in for this story. Where are you listening from right now? Are you curled up in bed, maybe under a blanket? Or are you watching from a quiet room somewhere far away? And what time is it? Where you are? Is it late at night, with the world silent around you, or bright daylight, where shadows feel less threatening? Because the truth Jacob carried into Cedar Valley was the kind that chills no matter the hour. The Fairmonts had long claimed to be of European nobility, a prestigious bloodline descended from Yorkshire, England. They had lived in Cedar Valley for decades with wealth, elegance, and influence. But what Jacob discovered in those yellow documents was that their lineage hid something else entirely. This wasn't a tale of the supernatural. No ghost, no curse. Instead, something far darker, far more terrifying, a bloodline that had systematically cultivated cruelty across 3 generations. Violence and manipulation weren't accidents in this family. They were traditions. Their inheritance wasn't just land and wealth, but an unbroken thread of coldness, deception, and murder. Those papers told of disappearances, quiet killings, and carefully staged cover-ups designed to preserve the family's facade. The Fairmonts weren't merely powerful, they were untouchable, because anyone who threatened to reveal them seemed to simply vanish. Before we continue unraveling this shadowed family tree, let me pause and invite you into this story. What do you think? Do you believe traits like cruelty or kindness can be passed down through blood, the way we inherit eye color or height? Or is it something society shapes in us? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Now let's set the stage. Cedar Valley in 1878 was a settlement of about 400 souls pressed between towering red sandstone cliffs and endless stretches of sagebrush. It had been founded by Mormon pioneers in the early 1850s families who had risked everything to travel west, seeking both faith and fertile land. By the time Jacob arrived, the valley was thriving wheat and barley fields, a growing cattle trade, and a close-knit community centered around the church. And at the very top of this society stood the Fairmont family. Their estate was massive, 3,000 acres of the valley's best land. The main house, a grand sandstone mansion, with imported fruit trees, white picket fences, and manicured gardens, was a beacon of wealth on the frontier. To neighbors, it looked like civilization itself had taken root in the desert. At its head was Augustus Fairmont, silver-haired, commanding, always immaculately dressed. He carried himself like aristocracy, and he often reminded the townsfolk that his lineage was proof of superiority, intellectually, socially, and spiritually. With imported furniture, elaborate crests, and polished genealogical charts, Augustus wove a narrative of noble descent, and the people believed him. He had arrived with his beautiful wife, Elena, and their infant son back in 1847, already wealthy enough to buy up the valley's prime lands. Augustus became a church leader. His wife became the face of charity and refinement, and together, they established themselves as the community's ruling family. Their children were admired by all. Theodore 31 inherited his father's authority and ran much of the ranch. Marcus 28 had a gift for negotiations, bringing the family cattle business great profits. And Isabel 26, celebrated as the valley's most accomplished young woman, had married into another wealthy family, tying the Fairmont's influence to Salt Lake City. By the third generation, their prestige seemed unshakable, and yet, beneath the polished surface, something unspeakable lurked. Something Jacob Hensworth's satchel would soon expose. But before we press on, let me ask you this: if you lived in Cedar Valley back then, would you have trusted a family like the Fairmonts? Or would you have felt that uneasy tug, that sense that something wasn't quite right? The third generation of Fairmonts seemed just as flawless as the ones before them. Augustus Jr., only 17, and his twin sister Victoria, matched with their cousin Edgar, 15, were admired as shining examples of youth on the frontier. Bright, ambitious, and effortlessly charismatic, they carried themselves with the confidence of leaders. Their teachers praised them as exceptional students. Their peers followed them almost instinctively, and the community began to whisper that the Fairmonts truly were different. Tell me, have you ever met someone who seemed to step into a room and immediately command it without saying a word? Someone whose presence alone was enough to silence others? That was the Fairmont children. What made the family's reputation so striking wasn't simply their wealth or their land, it was the way misfortune never seemed to touch them. While other pioneer families buried infants, battled crop failures, or lost livestock to harsh winters, the Fairmonts appeared untouched by tragedy. Their children were always healthy, their harvests steady, their businesses always expanding. And when disputes arose, whether over land water rights or contracts, the Fairmonts always seemed to come out on top. Strangely, their rivals would soon suffer illnesses, failed harvests, or sudden financial ruin that forced them to concede. To outsiders, this was just proof of the Fairmonts' intelligence and noble breeding. Few dared to wonder whether these coincidences were carefully arranged. Let me pause here. What do you think? Was it luck, providence? Or do you believe someone in the family was quietly pulling strings, ensuring every outcome bent in their favor? By the late 1870s, their influence reached far beyond Cedar Valley. Augustus Fairmont himself corresponded with businessmen in Salt Lake City, Denver, even San Francisco. Their travels opened new doors for trade, and the family's role as generous benefactors to the valley made them appear not just powerful, but benevolent. Cedar Valley thrived in their shadow, and then came that fateful February morning in 1878, when a stranger rode into town with a satchel of papers that threatened to upend it all. Jacob Hensworth, a genealogist from Philadelphia, was no ordinary traveler. He specialized in tracing bloodlines and resolving inheritance disputes. Hired by a wealthy Eastern family, his research had led him across courthouses and archives throughout the territories. A tangled claim to a Pennsylvania estate worth more than $50,000 had brought him west, and in the records he'd found something peculiar. Among the claimants was a man styling himself as Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley, Utah Territory. So let me ask you, dear listener, if a fortune of $50, $1,000 unthinkable wealth in 1878 was at stake, how far do you think people would go to secure it? Would documents be forged? Would rivals disappear? As Hensworth's carriage rolled down Cedar Valley's main street past rough-hewn cabins and weathered storefronts, the Fairmont estate rose from the landscape like something from another world. To his eyes, it looked like an English manor transplanted onto American soil. In his journal, he later wrote that stepping into Cedar Valley was like stumbling across a fragment of the old world improbably preserved in the wilderness. His first meeting with Augustus Fairmont occurred on February 15, 1878, inside the mansion's richly appointed study. Imagine it, shelves lined with leather-bound books, oil paintings in heavy gilded frames, a polished mahogany desk at the center of the room. Augustus himself, with his silver hair and aristocratic bearing, offered imported brandy and the practiced charm of a noble host. At first, everything seemed as it should. Augustus presented a portfolio of documents, birth certificates, marriage records, letters stamped with English seals, all neatly tracing the Fairmont line back to noble Yorkshire landowners. The claim to the Pennsylvania estate looked solid, almost airtight, but Jacob Hensworth had the trained eye of a man who'd seen too many forgeries in his career. As he turned the pages detail by detail, something unsettled him. A wrong flourish in a signature, an ink inconsistent with its supposed date, a parish seal that didn't match his memory of others. Little by little, the cracks began to show. And this brings me to you. If you were Hensworth sitting in that lavish study with a man like Augustus Fairmont smiling across the desk, would you have dared to question the documents aloud? Or would you have stayed silent, sensing the danger, but not yet ready to name it? The more Jacob Hensworth studied the Fairmont papers, the more unease grew in his chest. At first glance, the documents were convincing: birth records, parish seals, pedigrees stretching back generations. But Jacob's trained eye caught the cracks. The paper, allegedly from the 1700s, was far too uniform, as if it had been milled in a modern press. Official seals bore spelling errors no clerk in London would have ever allowed. And most damning of all, the handwriting across decades, even centuries, looked too similar, as though it all had flowed from the same hand. Let me pause and ask you, have you ever spotted a small detail others missed? Something so subtle, yet once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. That's exactly what Jacob was experiencing. When he cautiously raised his concerns, Augustus Fairmont's smile never faltered. The warmth of hospitality still lingered in his words, but Jacob sensed a chill underneath a predator's calculation, quiet and precise. Augustus's eyes no longer seemed friendly. They seemed to be measuring him. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said smoothly, "family histories are delicate things. Sometimes, preservation requires creative measures. Surely a man of your experience understands that the spirit of truth can be more important than the letter of documentation." Can you imagine being in that study, hearing those words and realizing they weren't just about genealogy? They were a warning. If it were you, would you have pushed further or politely smiled and let the matter drop? That evening, Hensworth found himself at the Fairmont dinner table. It hadn't been an invitation, it had been a summons. The dining hall was extraordinary, gleaming crystal imported china service fit for New York or London, nor the Utah frontier. Augustus presided with his wife, Eleanina, flanked by their sons Theodore and Marcus, their wives, and the younger Fairmont heirs. Yet, it wasn't the wealth that unsettled Jacob most. It was the way the family interacted. Every remark was layered, Every glance exchanged seemed to carry hidden meanings. When talk turned to neighbors who had mysteriously left Cedar Valley or to partnerships that had collapsed, the Fairmonts displayed no grief, no empathy. Only cold detachment, as though loss and ruin were natural occurrences in their grand design. And then there were the twins Augustus Jr. and Victoria, just 17. Their presence was the most disturbing of all. They spoke with the polish of adults with a calculated precision, far beyond their years. They watched every word like observers at a chess match, anticipating moves before they were made. At one point, Elela Nena mentioned the Caldwell family, how the patriarch had died suddenly the year before, leaving a widow and children struggling to survive. Victoria's response froze the room. How unfortunate, she said coolly, that Mr. Caldwell proved so inadequate to the challenges of frontier life. Then she turned, locking eyes with her twin brother, and a faint smile passed between them. Jacob would later write that moment sent a chill through him, colder than the February wind outside. Now let me ask you, have you ever heard words spoken with such casual cruelty that it made your stomach turn? Can you imagine hearing them from the lips of a teenager? After dinner, Augustus beckoned Jacob back into the study, this time with the mask slipping further. Over brandy, his voice carried less charm, more truth. He spoke of the frontier as a proving ground, where only the strong survived and the weak simply vanished. He hinted at rival families who had once stood against the Fairmont's families, who had later suffered misfortunes of illness, financial collapse, even untimely deaths. And then Augustus leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal snifter, and delivered a final, quiet warning. Mr. Hensworth, I trust our family documentation meets your professional standards. It would be most unfortunate if technical irregularities were to overshadow the essential truth of our heritage. A man of your intelligence must surely recognize that some truths are more important than others. The threat in Augustus's words was subtle, but unmistakable. What froze Jacob Hensworth's blood wasn't the threat itself, it was the casual way Augustus delivered it, as though intimidating a professional researcher was just another part of a polite business discussion. That night, Jacob returned to his small rented room at the boarding house, only to discover something deeply unsettling. His satchel had been disturbed. His careful arrangement of papers was shuffled out of order, and the window latch tight when he left now sat slightly ajar. Tell me, have you ever returned to your room and felt instantly that someone had been there? That chilling sense that unseen eyes had studied your private world? That's exactly what Jacob felt. The following morning, the widow, Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, delivered alarming news. She said she had received a midnight message. Jacob's mother in Philadelphia had fallen gravely ill and was calling for him. The message had been delivered by who else? A Fairmont ranch hand. But Jacob knew better. His mother was in perfect health. He had received a cheerful letter from her just days before leaving for Utah. The urgency, the fabrication, the timing, all of it was a ploy. The Fairmonts wanted him gone, and quickly. Now let me ask you, what would you do in Jacob's place? Would you pack your things and flee, or stay and push deeper, knowing powerful eyes were watching your every move? Jacob chose cunning. He pretended to believe the lie announcing his immediate departure with the proper display of filial concern. But instead of heading east, he diverted quietly to the county seat where the official courthouse records were kept, and what he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The records told a story very different from the one Augustus Fairmont had spun. The family that arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 had not been Fairmonts at all. Their name was Fleer. Augustus Fleer had purchased his land with gold coins and bank drafts scattered across various institutions, transactions that suggested not careful investment, but money of questionable origins. Even more chilling were the records from before Utah. The Fleer family had been wanted for questioning in Missouri and Kansas, in connection with a string of unexplained deaths. Do you feel the tension rising? Imagine Jacob alone in that dusty courthouse, turning brittle pages and watching a pattern of misfortune emerge, always circling the same family. In Independence, Missouri, a merchant who refused to sell his store to Augustus Fleer suddenly died of a heart attack. Neighbors swore he had been in perfect health. His grieving widow, crushed by debts, sold the store for a fraction of its worth to Augustus Fleer. In Lawrence, Kansas, a landowner who disputed Fleer's farmland claim died when his horse threw him from a bridge. Later townsfolk discovered the bridge had been deliberately weakened. The stories multiplied. Each new town, the same shadowy pattern. The Fleers would arrive, present themselves as respectable newcomers, and soon after accidents, illnesses, financial ruin would strike their rivals. Always selectively, always with precision, and always in ways that left the Fleers stronger, wealthier, more untouchable. Have you ever heard the phrase, too many coincidences to be coincidence? That's exactly the trail Jacob was following. Each accident was convenient, each misfortune perfectly timed, each rival swept aside, and with every revelation the truth grew darker. The family celebrated in Cedar Valley as noble Fairmonts were in fact the ruthless Fleers carrying with them a legacy of deception, sabotage, and quiet violence. The pattern was undeniable, too precise, too consistent. What Jacob Hensworth uncovered was not the random misfortunes of unlucky rivals, but a deliberately orchestrated campaign. Every ruined business, every fatal accident, every grieving widow, it all fit together, like pieces of a puzzle designed to consolidate the Fleer family's power. But the deeper Jacob dug, the darker the truth became. He traced the family further back, before Utah, before Missouri, back to a small industrial town in Pennsylvania. There they had lived under another name, the Fallners. Court records from the 1820s and 1830s painted a chilling picture. Every Fallner venture ended profitably for them. But their partners and competitors seemed cursed. Accidents, bankruptcies, sudden deaths. Again and again the Fallners thrived while everyone around them suffered. Let me ask you, have you ever met someone who always seems to come out ahead no matter how many others fall around them? Do you think it's luck or design? To confirm his suspicions, Jacob sought out a man who remembered those years well, Sheriff Thomas Brennan. Now in his 70s, Brennan agreed to meet him in a dim Philadelphia tavern. Over a glass of whiskey, the old lawman leaned close and said, they were different. Not just rich or ambitious, different. The Fallners looked at people like specimens, studying, probing, searching for weaknesses. They never stopped calculating. Brennan described a family that operated with almost military precision. Each member had a role. Children were trained to observe, to manipulate, to report on their neighbors. Business partnerships weren't about profit. They were traps designed to gain secrets, siphon wealth and break rivals from the inside. And then came Brennan's most disturbing memory. I once heard old William Faulkner refer to the rest of us as the breeding stock. Think about that for a moment. What kind of people look at their neighbors, their friends, their entire community, and see not fellow human beings, but animals to be exploited? The sheriff leaned back, shaking his head. They had a talent, he said, for making people destroy themselves. A rival would be nudged into a reckless investment, a politician tricked into an accusation he couldn't prove, a suitor maneuvered into disgrace. The Faulkners created the stage, set the temptation, and then just watched as their victims pulled the trigger on their own downfall. And technically, they never broke the law. Every tragedy looked like misfortune, every ruin like bad judgment. But the results were as final as murder. But perhaps the most chilling part was how the Faulkners treated their own children. Brennan's voice dropped lower, his eyes hardening with memory. I once saw William Faulkner force his 8-year-old boy to stand by while they slaughtered a horse that had broken its leg. The child sobbed, begged them to save it. But his father made him watch until the tears stopped, then forced him to help butcher the animal. He paused, finishing his drink. Said it was important for the boy to learn that sentimentality is weakness, that mercy has no place in survival. Can you imagine that what kind of family teaches its children that compassion is a disease to be cured? By 1843, the Faulkners had abandoned Pennsylvania, slipping away just ahead of a grand jury investigation into their business practices. And from there, their trail of shadows continued westward. They had liquidated their assets with remarkable speed and efficiency, so fast in fact that it almost seemed rehearsed. Was this really a family caught by surprise, or a group that had always planned for sudden flight? Brennan never learned where they went, but he always suspected they had resurfaced under new identities, quietly continuing their operations somewhere else. Hensworth's deeper investigation revealed that the transformation from Faulkner to Flea to Fairmont wasn't just a matter of names. Could a mere change of spelling explain away decades of shadows? Or was this evidence of something far more deliberate, a refined system for building new identities, creating convincing genealogies, and slipping into fresh communities undetected? The documents Augustus had once flaunted were stunning forgeries, but what unsettled Hensworth most was the realization that they weren't the first. They were only the latest layer in a long perfected process. Imagine a family that instead of passing down heirlooms or traditions, had carefully preserved methods of deception generation after generation. How many communities had they touched before Cedar Valley? How many people had unknowingly walked into their web? This was not biology, not genetics, but something darker, a culture of deliberate cruelty. A family that treated manipulation and exploitation as craft, honing it, the way others might cultivate farming, music, or trade. And if the Fairmonts truly were the same line that had lived as the Fleers and earlier still as the Faulkners, then their 30 years in Cedar Valley wasn't just a residence. It was the most successful stage of a campaign of psychological warfare against an unsuspecting community. Armed with this, Hensworth returned to Cedar Valley. On the surface, he was bringing new documentation to strengthen the Fairmont's inheritance claims. In truth, he was chasing evidence, anything that could connect this family to their past masks, anything that could unmask the full scope of their operations. But what he found on that second visit was more chilling than even his grim expectations. The Cedar Valley that had once appeared to him as a harmonious frontier town revealed its hidden machinery. Beneath the prosperous facade was something closer to control a society bent to the will of a single family. How much power can one household hold when it controls both bread and rumor coin and reputation? Through economic leverage, whispered influence, and quiet intimidation, the Fairmonts had built not a community, but a stage. Hensworth's method was simple: trace those who had left. Why did families abandon this seemingly thriving place? The records gave official reasons: better land, new markets, fresh opportunities. But when he dug deeper, when he followed names across county lines, the truth emerged: many weren't chasing dreams. They were running. Take the Morrisons. Officially, they left after tragedy in 1865, when young James Morrison died in a hunting accident. But is it coincidence that James had been investigating grain shipments controlled by the Fairmonts, shipments riddled with irregularities, just days before he died? Was it really an accident? Or something silenced before it could be spoken? Or the Caldwells, the blacksmiths who left in 1872? Their patriarch Robert had been respected, steady, a man of reason, until suddenly he wasn't. Overnight, he began raving about poison in his fields, conspiracies among his neighbors, invisible enemies at his forge. A breakdown, people said. But what if it wasn't madness? What if he had seen something, said too much, and was made to look insane? His erratic behavior had shattered his credibility, leaving the Caldwell family no choice but to sell everything and slip away in disgrace. But what made the case impossible to dismiss was what came next. Theodore Fairmont himself purchased the blacksmith shop for a fraction of its worth. Was Caldwell's madness truly his own? Or was it carefully engineered? Perhaps most chilling was the fate of the Hartwells, once owners of the valley's richest farmland. Samuel Hartwell had dared to defy the Fairmonts, blocking their attempt to expand grazing rights in 1873. 6 months later, catastrophe struck in waves. Their prized bull succumbed to a strange illness. Their well turned fowl, tainted by chemicals no farmer in the valley should have had access to. And their daughter, healthy spirited, was thrown from her horse, left crippled for life. Coincidences or a campaign of silent war? By 1874, the Hartwells were ruined. Forced to sell their land just to survive, they left Cedar Valley as beggars, stripped of everything they had built. And yet, as Hensworth's notes revealed, they were not alone. Every family touched by such disasters shared one common trait: they had challenged the Fairmonts. Business rivals, political opponents, even those who merely knew too much, one by one they were broken or erased. And then came an even darker revelation. Some families hadn't merely left, they had vanished. The Piton storekeepers supposedly moved to California in 1869. Yet in all of California's records, they do not exist. Why would a family abandon their possessions, their photographs, their neighbors without a word? The Jenkins family followed the same pattern. They had battled the Fairmonts over water rights in 1876 and were said to have moved to Colorado. But their homestead was left half lived in. Crops, unharvested livestock wandering the fields. Where could they have gone? Or more disturbingly, What if they never went anywhere at all? Just when we thought we'd uncovered the full horror, Cedar Valley grew darker still. If this story already has your heart racing, ask yourself, how deep does this shadow stretch? Hensworth's true breakthrough came not from public records, but from the private correspondence of Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling. An elderly widow, she had lived in Cedar Valley since its founding and filled her journals with meticulous notes. Imagine decades of careful observations written by someone who had seen everything, yet been too afraid to speak. Now frail and bedridden, Mrs. Sterling finally agreed to confide in Hensworth. Her voice trembled as her thin fingers traced the lines of her journal. They knew everything she whispered, and she meant everything. Who quarreled with their spouse? Who was in debt? Which children faltered at school? Secrets of illness, weakness, despair. Collected, catalogued, and quietly used, the Fairmonts had built more than a fortune. They had built a surveillance state in miniature, a network of whispers and watchful eyes. And with each secret, each vulnerability, they pulled tighter strings of control. They had perfected the art of pressure, applied with surgical precision at the exact moment it would break their target, while ensuring there was never enough proof to hold them accountable. But Mrs. Sterling's most chilling admission pierced deeper than anything Hensworth had yet uncovered. The families hadn't left. They hadn't started new lives elsewhere. They had been erased. Her frail voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible above the ticking of her mantel clock. The Petans never went to California, she said. I saw Marcus Fairmont myself, with 2 ranch hands. They were loading something heavy into a wagon under cover of night. They drove it up toward the old mine shafts. The wagon returned before dawn, empty and scrubbed clean. And this was no isolated incident. Her journals spoke of the Jenkins family's disappearance with the same eerie consistency, strange movements near abandoned mines, Fairmont men traveling with tools and wagons at night, unexplained smoke rising from hidden valleys. How many lives had ended in those forgotten shafts of rock and darkness? And how many shallow lies had been told to explain away the missing? This forced Hensworth to accept a possibility he had resisted. The Fairmonts weren't merely frauds or manipulators. They were predators, serial killers cloaked in respectability, weaving their crimes into the fabric of Cedar Valley so completely that the town itself became complicit in its silence. But just as this realization took hold, something shifted. The hunter became the hunted. His rented room at the boarding house was no longer simply disturbed. It was searched with an almost theatrical obviousness, as though unseen hands wanted him to know he was being watched. The locals he'd once trusted grew evasive. Statements they had given with certainty days before suddenly blurred into "I must have been mistaken." Fear had rewritten their memories. Even Mrs. Patterson, the wary boarding house operator, broke her neutrality to warn him. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Hensworth, I think it best you finish your business quickly. People are saying you're stirring up old troubles, and some of those troubles are dangerous." That same evening, the mask came off. A boy arrived at his door, though boy hardly described him. Augustus Fairmont Jr., barely 17 but bearing the same cold refinement as his grandfather. He delivered his summons with a poise far too calculated for his age. "Mr. Hensworth," He said his words deliberate, his eyes unblinking. My grandfather is eager to discuss the documentation you've uncovered. He is particularly interested in the thoroughness of your research and the conclusions you may have reached. This was no invitation. It was a command. And the phrasing left no doubt Hensworth was no longer an investigator. He was the subject of an inquisition, February 23rd, 1878. What awaited him at the Fairmont estate was not a dinner. It was a tribunal. The entire family gathered, every generation, present, their gazes converging, like a panel of judges studying a criminal. What does a man do seated at a table where every smile is a mask, every question a trap, and every glass of wine might conceal more than hospitality? And more importantly, would he leave that dinner alive? Throughout the meal, the rhythm of the interrogation never faltered. Each family member's question overlapped seamlessly with the next, like parts of a rehearsed symphony. It wasn't conversation, it was a cross-examination. Every polite smile, every murmured pleasantry was a sharpened blade hidden in velvet. What unsettled Hensworth most was not the words themselves, but the precision of the performance. A half-lifted eyebrow from Theodore silenced Victoria before she spoke too much. A tap of silverware against porcelain from Elena shifted the subject without breaking the flow. The Fairmonts weren't merely a family, they were an organism. A single many-headed predator rehearsed in the art of neutralizing threats. When Elena leaned forward, her frail hand hovering close to his as though she were a doting grandmother, her voice carried a warmth that chilled him more than open hostility ever could. "Mr. Hensworth," she cooed as she placed a delicate slice of pie before him. "I do hope you found Cedar Valley hospitable. We take pride in caring for those who visit us, but of course, hospitality depends on mutual respect and privacy." Her eyes lingered just long enough to make clear that privacy was not a request. It was a condition of survival. The children, disturbingly well trained in the family craft, provided the most unnerving insight into what kind of legacy the Fairmonts were cultivating. Victoria, barely 17, recounted community disputes with the detachment of a surgeon, discussing anatomy, analyzing weaknesses, predicting outcomes, suggesting pressure points. Edgar, even younger, spoke of leverage in terms of debts, reputations, and unfortunate tendencies of townsfolk. His vocabulary, too polished, too adult for a boy his age. By the time Augustus slid the leather portfolio across the table, the offer was less temptation than ultimatum. A bank draft worth a year's wages for most men. Genealogical documents polished to perfection. And the promise, or was it the command, that Hensworth would find nothing else worth pursuing in Cedar Valley. When he refused, the temperature of the room shifted instantly. The smile stiffened. The voices lost their honeyed lilt, and the mask of civility began to crack. Augustus's cultured tone remained unchanged, but his eyes turned hard, glassy. "I must say, Mr. Hensworth, you disappoint me. We offered you a path to comfort, to professional success. Instead, you've chosen what? To stir ashes of the past, to damage a family that has given this community decades of prosperity." Theodore's voice cut in calm but carrying the weight of youth and raw strength. "You're far from home, sir? Roads out here are treacherous. Men disappear in these valleys. Accidents happen. Carriage wheels break, hunters mistake their targets. Surely you understand. The threat hung in the air, heavier than the scent of roasted meat and pipe smoke. The family sat in perfect silence, waiting for his response. For the first time, Hensworth fully understood this was not just about documents or inheritance or history. He had walked into the lair of a dynasty that had thrived for generations on blood and fear. And now, they were deciding whether he would walk out alive. Hensworth's hands trembled as he turned the brittle pages of the ledger. The entries were written in the same calm, precise script Augustus had used when offering him compensation at dinner. But here, the words stripped away all pretense of civility. Necessary elimination, James Morrison, July 3rd, 1865. Cause interference in grain shipments, method hunting accident arranged. Necessary elimination, Robert Caldwell, March 14th, 1872. Cause disruptive accusations, method ingestion gradual. There were dozens of such entries, each written without emotion, each describing the extinguishing of a human life as if it were no more consequential than a line item in an account book. The ledger was proof beyond question, not only of murder, but of a multi-generational conspiracy sustained through systematic terror. But as he wrapped the book and slipped it into his satchel, a sound froze him in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate crunching on the gravel outside the shaft. A lantern beam flickered against the rocks near the entrance. Then another. Voices low measured and all too familiar. The Fairmonts had anticipated him. Hensworth extinguished his own lantern, instantly plunging himself into suffocating darkness. The reek of decomposition pressed in on him as he crouched among the bones, clutching the ledger to his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he knew that the narrow shaft offered only one exit. The same exit now guarded by men who would not hesitate to bury him alive among their other necessary eliminations. One of the voices drifted down the shaft, calm and mocking. "Mr. Hensworth, you're trespassing. That's a very dangerous thing to do in this country. Mines collapse without warning. Curious strangers go missing. No one ever asks too many questions." Another voice, young, confident. "Augustus Jr. Grandfather will want him alive." For now, the lantern light grew brighter as the sound of shifting stones marked their attempt to widen the entrance he had forced. They were coming in. For the first time in his career, Hensworth realized that his pursuit of truth had brought him to a place where truth might cost him his life. The entries read like ledgers from a merchant's office, stripped of empathy or remorse. Every line was businesslike, chilling in its clarity. Robert Caldwell, March 15th, 1872. Arsenic poisoning administered over a 6-week period. Subject discovered irregularities in grain contracts and intended to notify territorial authorities. Elimination necessary to preserve family security. Jenkins family, August 3rd, 1876. Chloroform followed by manual strangulation. The family had retained legal counsel regarding disputed water rights. Elimination of entire household required to prevent complications. James Morrison, October 12th, 1865. Staged hunting accident, defective ammunition prepared. Subject had compiled evidence of fraudulent shipping manifests. Elimination essential to maintain government contracts. On and on it went, over 30 entries spanning 3 decades. Each death recorded with precision. Each killing planned to resemble misfortune, disease, or mishap. The ledger revealed not random violence, but a system and evolving science of elimination. The Fairmonts had cultivated expertise in poisons, staged accidents, and efficient disposal, ensuring their victims vanished without suspicion. Most disturbing was the tone. These were not confessions of guilt, nor even boasts of conquest. Each entry included cold assessments, cost-benefit analyses weighing the potential damage posed by an individual against the expense of orchestrating their demise. Human life reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. Murder redefined as corporate risk management. As Hensworth photographed the pages with the portable camera he had wisely carried, a sound froze him in place. Voices, low deliberate, echoed faintly from the mouth of the shaft. He strained to hear. The cultured cadence of Augustus Fairmont was unmistakable. "The genealogist has proven more resourceful than expected," Augustus said. "His inquiries exceed acceptable limits, and his refusal of our offer leaves us no choice. He now represents a permanent threat to family security. The matter requires immediate resolution." Hensworth's blood turned to ice. The Fairmonts had predicted his steps as they had predicted so many others before. He was not merely an investigator, he was now an entry in waiting a line destined for their ledger. And they had come as they always did to close accounts. The genealogist hid the ledger and photographic plates deep in a side passage, praying discovery would be delayed. Then, with desperate courage, he attempted escape through a secondary shaft. The tunnel had partly collapsed. When he squeezed through, the loose stone shifted, sending a cascade of rubble clattering down. The sound betrayed him. Shouts rang out behind him. Lantern light bounced against the rock. They were coming. Augustus himself led the hunt, flanked by his sons, Theodore and Marcus, and a cadre of loyal ranch hands. These men were not reluctant accomplices, they were practiced enforcers in a family enterprise of death. They hemmed Hensworth into a narrow throat of rock where retreat was impossible. "Mr. Hensworth." Augustus called, his voice unnervingly steady in the confined air. "Your diligence is commendable. But your investigation concludes here. Your absence will be attributed to the hazards of abandoned workings, a tragic accident, as happens to so many inexperienced Easterners who misjudge our frontier. What made the moment unbearable was not rage or malice, but the absence of either." Augustus spoke with the clipped efficiency of a banker confirming a transaction. His words made clear the Fairmont creed. Killing was not crime, not sin. It was business. Routine. Necessary. Theodore and Marcus mirrored their father's chilling composure, discussing the matter as though planning a hunting trip rather than a murder. "We'll need to stage the scene carefully." Theodore observed, his voice clinical. An apparent cave-in he was exploring where he shouldn't. By the time his body is discovered, if it ever is, decay will erase all trace of foul play. Marcus added without hesitation. "We'll also need to deal with the horse and his belongings. Best if it looks like he left Cedar Valley on his own before his accident. That way, no one comes looking too soon." Their words revealed a terrible truth. This was not improvisation. The Fairmonts had protocols for murder, tested and perfected through repetition. Hensworth's life was to be ended according to procedure. His disappearance explained by a neat, prearranged narrative. But the script was abruptly broken. From the mouth of the shaft came a shout that did not belong to the Fairmonts. Augustus Fairmont. The voice was strong, commanding, and unmistakably official. "This is Territorial Sheriff Tom Bradley. I hold a warrant for your arrest in connection with multiple missing persons. Come out with your hands where I can see them and bring Mr. Hensworth unharmed." The reaction was instantaneous. Augustus's mask of calm cracked his eyes, flashing with sudden calculation. For over 30 years, the Fairmonts had operated without fear of interruption. Never before had the machinery of law caught them in the act. Now, cornered in the very mine that housed their secrets, they faced exposure not just as frauds, but as murderers. What followed was nearly an hour of tense stalemate in the black, suffocating air of the mine. Augustus bargained, first offering money-land influence. When bribes failed, he shifted to threats promising ruin to anyone who defied him. But Sheriff Bradley had anticipated such tactics. He had come not alone, but with deputies, armed and resolute men who had ridden hard from the capital with orders to end the Fairmont reign of terror. By the early morning of February 25, 1878, it was over. The Fairmont family, Augustus, his sons, and their accomplices were led in chains from the same tunnels that had swallowed dozens of their victims. For the first time, the predators were caged. The aftermath revealed horrors even Hensworth had not guessed. Deputies uncovered additional burial shafts scattered across the property. In a concealed laboratory beneath the Fairmont mansion, shelves of vials and chemical instruments testified to their mastery of poisons. Hidden compartments yielded false identity papers, elaborate forged genealogies, and letters hinting at other operations in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Kansas. Most unsettling of all were the files. Locked drawers contained thick dossiers on nearly every resident of Cedar Valley. Records of deaths, family scandals, secret illnesses, private vices. The Fairmonts had catalogued their neighbors like livestock, reducing an entire town to a web of leverage and vulnerabilities tools for manipulation and control. The trial that summer in Salt Lake City became a national spectacle. Reporters from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia filled the courtroom, their readers riveted by the tale of frontier aristocrats who cloaked themselves in borrowed nobility while practicing systematic murder. Witness after witness described the family's uncanny unity, their methodical rituals, and their ability to condition their children into predators, devoid of empathy. For many Americans, the case shattered illusions about the West as a land of simple honesty and opportunity. The Fairmonts had shown how refinement and savagery could be fused into something more dangerous than either a dynasty of killers who treated murder as business and life itself as currency. The Fairmonts' younger generation showed a chilling lack of remorse. On the stand, these young men naively asserted that their killings were justified because they believed in the family's innate superiority over their victims. Augustus Fairmont, the head of the family, stunned the courtroom when he testified. He did not consider his actions a crime but a form of natural selection. In a calm, lecture-like voice, Augustus declared, "Human society is inherently a competitive environment. The strong and the intelligent will seize opportunities. The weak will sooner or later become resources for the superior." Imagine sitting in a courtroom in 1878, listening to a serial killer explain his actions in such a cold tone. How would you feel? Meanwhile, Eleanor Fairmont, the woman who helped maintain the family education system, described calmly how they raised their children. From a young age, the Fairmont children were trained to eliminate empathy, learned to manipulate others and were indoctrinated with the belief that people were just resources to be exploited. If a child showed weakness, they were exposed to controlled violence to eradicate that weakness. When the judge asked Victoria Fairmont, a young girl in the family, about her feelings towards the murdered families, she simply tilted her head in confusion and replied, "I don't understand the question. They were simply obstacles, and obstacles need to be eliminated." That answer sent shivers down the courtroom. The trial ended with Augustus Eleanor Theodore and Marcus Fairmont sentenced to death by hanging. The younger generation, still minors, were given long prison sentences in the hope of rehabilitation, but most later reports suggest that eradicating the Fairmont mentality was nearly impossible. The Fairmont farm mines and all of their property were confiscated by the government to compensate the victims' families. The blood-stained tunnels were sealed forever, and a memorial plaque was erected in Cedar Valley to commemorate the Fairmont murders. Jacob Hensworth, who had nearly lost his life, returned to Philadelphia a changed man. He devoted his life to exposing fake genealogies, studying families who used false identities to cover up their crimes. His 1879 book, The Fairmont Deception, quickly became a bestseller and is considered one of the cornerstones of modern criminal psychology. The Fairmont murders are more than just a bloody tragedy of the Wild West. They also serve as a reminder that evil can be systematically fostered and passed down from generation to generation in seemingly honorable and civilized families. And more importantly, they remind us that the isolation of small remote communities can be fertile ground for sophisticated predators. So what do you think? Has the whole truth about the Fairmont family been exposed? Or are there other dark secrets buried with them? What time are you watching this video? Late at night, early in the morning, or in the middle of the day? And where are you watching from? A dark room or a crowded coffee shop? Share your thoughts in the comments. How many other Fairmont families have existed in American history that we have never heard of? If you find this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with your friends who love creepy mysteries. Because the American West still has countless secrets to uncover, and Sleepy History Tales will continue to explore with you. See you in the next episode.